What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey there, welcome to another week of Open Line, listen to me, of Call to Communion here on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. We're glad to have you with us. This program is unlike any other program up and down the radio dial because we are specifically here to serve non-Catholics. And that could be never been a Catholic. It could be I was a Catholic when I was a kid. I left the church when I was 30. I left the church when I was blah, 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 fill in the blank. Or, like we say, maybe you just have questions about the Catholic faith, and as an outsider, sort of, you would like to get those questions answered. So here is our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us outside of North America, please dial the country code for the U.S., and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. Again, the phone number, 833-288-EWTN. Michael Birchfield is our producer. Ryan Penny is our phone screener. And Michael McCall is handling social media today. He'll be glad to pass on any questions that you might want to pose via Facebook or YouTube. We got a lot of questions from that particular social media venue. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Hey, Tom. How are you?
Great. How was your weekend?
It was eventful.
Eventful?
Mm-hmm.
Anything you care to share? As the teacher says, no.
Nope, just
nope.
eventful.
Okay. We'll leave it at that.
I did learn a new word.
What was that?
Maieutic.
Maieutic.
Mm-hmm.
Can you spell it?
Yes, M-A-I-E-U-T-I-C, maieutic.
Can you use it as a sentence?
I can. Socrates' pedagogical method was maieutic.
Okay.
It means that form of inquiry or instruction aiming to bring a person's latent ideas into clear consciousness.
Okay.
Comes from the Greek word meaning midwifery.
Well, all right then.
So, maieutic, your word for the day.
It pays to increase your word power.
Mm-hmm.
We appreciate that. Here's a question from Liza checking us out on YouTube. And we've done this question maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago. How should I answer when I am told there is no evidence of the existence of Jesus? Do you remember when that came up? It was a different person that contacted us with that question.
How should you respond when someone tells you that there's no evidence for the existence of Jesus? You should scratch your head and maybe tap them on the forehead and make sure that you're talking about the same thing. So the question of the existence of Jesus is a historical question, and so we want to look for the kinds of evidence that we would apply to the examination of any historical question about some event that took place in the past.
Right.
Let me point to the most obvious, most manifest, the hardest to miss piece of evidence for the existence of Jesus as a person. Before I do that, let me make a comparison. If a baseball suddenly came, from your peripheral vision and hit you in the head, would you assert that there was no evidence for there being a pitcher or a batter? There's no evidence that anybody actually threw this baseball that just conked me in the head. All right. Well, the Catholic Church is the most manifest, obvious, and evident piece of historical data barreling down on your head like a giant baseball that got thrown by somebody. All right, so I mean, there it is.
There it is.
Here's this thing called, it's the most obvious fact in world history, this institution called Catholicism that came from somewhere. And the historical memory of this institution traces itself back to a singular person, namely Jesus Christ. So The existence of the Catholic Church as an institution cries out for historical explanation. All right, that's piece number one.
Okay.
Secondly, there is an enormous body of literature testifying to the existence of Jesus as a historical person. The most important sources, historical documents pointing to the existence of Jesus, are the canonical Gospels and the epistles. They are the best attested ancient documents that we have in the world, with the earliest extant copies with the greatest number of actual absolute copies of any ancient text. So if you think that the existence of a historical text is evidence for either the persons mentioned therein or the authors thereof, like, say, Plato's Republic, I don't think we have but maybe a couple of dozen ancient extant copies of Plato's Republic, and none of them date, to within centuries of the life of Plato himself. I don't know anybody doubting the existence of Plato, but copies of the New Testament and fragments, we have late first century fragments of the New Testament, early second century fragments, and whole codices from second, third century, all of which give immediate documentary evidence to the existence of Jesus and his circle of disciples. And then we have extra biblical literature by the church fathers, as well as pagan sources that make reference to Christ, and some of them are derogatory. I mean, they're not all fans of Jesus. So the Talmudic references to Jesus, Jesus' appearance in the writing of Jewish polemic and historical narrative like Josephus.
Josephus, I was
Roman
thinking
writers as well.
Yeah, these are disinterested parties.
Yeah, and some of them antagonistic.
Yeah.
So I don't know where you're getting off saying there's no historical evidence for Jesus.
Yeah, where do you begin with something like that?
I was like, give me your evidence for there not being any evidence. I mean, what are you talking about?
I don't know. But there you go. And Liza, we hope that is helpful for you. Thank you so much for checking in with us on YouTube. All right, in a moment here, we're going to get to the phones, and I want to give you the phone number. It is 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, you could also let us know if you're not a Catholic and you're listening to us. Well, that's great. We're glad that you're listening. But tell us why you're not a Catholic. Tell us what is holding you back from, jumping over that goal line there and becoming a Catholic yourself. There may be some great reason. There may be a misunderstanding about the Catholic Church's teachings, and we'd love to clear that up for you. 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. In a moment, we'll talk with Rusty in Michigan and lots more on this edition of Call to Communion. Stay with us. Tonight on Catholic Answers Live, Cy Kellett speaks with Stacy Trasancos about Eucharistic miracles for the first hour, Eucharistic miracles. And in the second hour, Doug Beaumont joins the show to discuss faith and works. always a great presentation on Catholic Answers Live with Cy Kellett. That's tonight, every weeknight at 6 p.m. Eastern, right here on EWTN Radio. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We're going to begin with Rusty in Dorr, Michigan. Rusty, what's on your mind today?
Doctor, I am 90. I just had my 35th great grandchild. So you have to be nice and talk slower and louder, okay?
Okay.
And then I'll give you my question. I have more friends in purgatory than I do on earth, and I got lots of friends on earth. But I want to know if the ones in purgatory can pray for me as I pray for them.
Yes. Short answer, yes. They can.
Good.
They can. The fact that the souls in purgatory can pray for us is not a dogma of the church. So the church hasn't said definitively that the souls in purgatory can pray for us. But here's what we can surmise. Everybody in purgatory is saved. They're all going to heaven. That means they have God's grace. They are united to God in charity. They love God. They want what God wants. God wants the salvation of the church. He wants the church to pray for itself, for its members, for one another. It stands to reason that the souls in purgatory would want to do that. The only thing the souls in purgatory cannot do is they cannot merit. They cannot earn anything. All the merit we can acquire, we acquire in this life. We don't acquire merit in the next life. But you don't have to merit to pray. Even a sinner, even someone in this life who's not yet saved, who hasn't met God, who hasn't been converted, who is still in mortal sin, can pray. Everybody can ask God for mercy. And but the souls in purgatory, they are in the state of grace. They do love God. They do love neighbor. Even though they cannot merit any longer, they can still pray and ask God for things.
Okay. Rusty, thank you so much for your call. And she doesn't sound 90 to me. She sounds pretty sharp.
35th great-grandchild.
That's impressive.
How do you do the birthdays?
Man, oh man. Just kind of wave at him, I suppose. Give him a hug. And then leave it at that. Hey, Rusty, thank you. That was a great call. And that opens up a line for you now, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. It is called to communion here on EWTN. Travis sent us an email. Travis says, I need some help in understanding this doctrine. It seems to me Jesus was very specific in how he instituted the Eucharist in both body and blood. And yet, Catholics say body, blood, soul, and divinity can be found wholly in the bread alone. How did this doctrine come about?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So, first of all, you're correct when you say that Christ says, this is my body, this is my blood. And Catholics acknowledge that the Eucharist is, properly speaking, the sacrament of Christ's body and blood. However, we know certain things about the state of Christ's body and blood. First of all, we know that Christ is a divine person. And where you have Christ, you have humanity and divinity. Mm-hmm. You cannot separate the two because Jesus is not two beings stuck together. Jesus Christ is one person that has two natures.
Right.
And now we don't know anything like that. We don't know the cat dog. We don't know like the horse alligator, right? We don't, everything that we know that as a concrete singular individual has but one nature. Right. So we don't have a good analogy. But so this is just an analogy. Imagine trying to separate, Tom Price's height from his weight. It's unintelligible. I couldn't have Tom without his height.
Yeah.
I couldn't have Tom without his weight. Well, you can't have Jesus without the divine and not divine nature and human nature, because that's who he is. All right. So if you have body and blood, you get divinity thrown in. All right. And there's a technical term for that. It's called concomitance, where you get the one, you get the other. And we also know that Christ dies only once. The book of Hebrews tells us that the death of Christ happens once for all. So you can't separate, just as you can't separate the divinity from the humanity, you cannot in actuality separate the body from the blood any longer, not after the death on Calvary, because to separate body and blood in actuality would mean to destroy the physical body of Jesus. But Jesus' physical body is whole and entire and glorified eternally. So the sacrament is properly the sacrament of his body and blood, but you can't have just body here and just blood there without killing him. But he's dead only once. So here's how the church understands this. Bread and wine, the pre-consecrated bread and wine, are symbols. And they signify body over here, blood over there, separated in a state of victimhood. They recall for us the separation of body and blood that took place on Calvary. But through the miracle of transubstantiation, when Christ is made truly present in the Eucharistic species, he's not made present in a state of body-blood separation, but whole and entire, because that's the nature of his glorified person now at the right hand of the Father. And it is the Jesus in heaven, the glorified Christ in heaven, who's made truly present in his proper person here and now. So that's the explanation for the doctrine.
Yeah,
and you're asking, when did this about? So as theologians have reflected on these truths of sacred Scripture and of Revelation, these are some of the logical consequences that have been spelled out in reflection that have entered into the dogmatic language of the Catholic Church.
I'm still working on the cat dog. It's quite a concept, you know. Does that mean end times if I see a cat dog walking down the sidewalk?
No, it probably just means a postmodernist cartoon.
Ah, got it. Okay. This is Called to Communion here on EWTN. One line open at the moment, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Let's go to Jack now in Los Angeles, listening on Sirius XM 130. Jack, what's on your mind today?
Hey, I'm wondering if I was talking with a Muslim friend, and they were talking about how accurate the Quran was, and I was just kind of curious as to how they would compare to, as far as the historical reliability, how that would compare to the biblical the accuracy.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the question. So the Quran was composed in the 7th century, and at some distance from Muhammad himself, who was illiterate and didn't take pen in hand and write things down, but he gave out stuff orally, and his followers took some of it. And there's some historical dispute about how much the words of the Quran actually reflect verbal dictation from Muhammad, and how much of it may be later interpolations. But in any event, it's essentially a 7th century text, and reflects the worldview of 7th century Arabia and Muhammad's exposure to certain strains of Christianity and Judaism that he encountered in his youth growing up there. But it purports to give accounts of events that took place centuries and centuries before. So it's at some remove, say in particular when he talks about the life of Jesus and Mary, we're 7 centuries away from the fact and reflecting traditions that were peculiar to his Arabian background. Whereas the 4 Gospels were written by close contemporaries of Jesus, and as well as those who knew them, that are not 7 centuries removed from the events they report, but in incredibly close proximity. And even though the distance between the Gospels and the life of Christ is mere decades, the Gospels themselves, by source critics, have been shown to reflect oral traditions that carry back immediately into the Aramaic of Jesus himself. So I would make the case that the New Testaments are very historically reliable texts, and there's no independent, objective historical data that can show the reliability of the Quran. Now, Muslims accept the Quran as reliable as an act of faith. They profess the Quran to be authoritative, and where the historical record shows otherwise, they simply discount the historical record. So if there were a conflict, say, about an event in the life of Jesus, and you have a 1st century account from Christian authors, and then a 7th century account by Muslim authors, and those two accounts differ, Well, the Muslim author is just going to stipulate, well, I don't accept the more proximate historical information. I reject the Christian account because it conflicts with the Quran. Well, that's not evidence for the reliability of the Quran. That's just evidence that this person fideistically accepts the Quran no matter what. And if you typically present a Muslim with arguments for the inaccuracy of the Quran, he's just going to dispute your evidence because he's already antecedently committed to the idea that the Quran is reliable.
Okay. Thank you for your call, Jack. We do appreciate that. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Let's go to Elizabeth now in Syracuse, listening on the Station of the Cross. Hey, Elizabeth, what's on your mind today?
Oh, thank you for the call, or for taking my call. This question is twofold. I was talking to somebody after Mass yesterday, and something came up, and I mentioned something that somebody who I know who has passed away had done. And I'm wondering, first of all, it was pertinent to the conversation, and it really wasn't in the vein of gossip, but is that considered calumny? And also, does that affect if that person's still in purgatory, will that affect them having to serve more time because what happened, what that person did, has caused some others on earth some problems?
Okay, thanks. I appreciate the question. This is a really interesting question, and one that I've never gotten before, to be honest with you. Can one commit the sin of calumny against the dead? I can't tell you that I've ever seen this question formulated precisely like that before, so I'm not going to speak from an authoritative document from the Catholic moral tradition. I'm going to put on my thinking cap and try to think through with you rationally. And I'm going to actually go back and research this a little bit later on to see if an authoritative teacher has already answered the question, because I'm not familiar with one. And here are the considerations that I'm going to bring. On the one hand, the position of the dead, say, in purgatory, for example, is not going to be adversely affected by somebody committing the sin of calumny against them. I mean, they've already merited what they're going to merit in this life.
Right.
They already are participating in the prayers and the intercessions of the church on behalf of the dead. So, you know, if I slander somebody who's dead, I mean, I'm not going to get them out of hell. I'm not going to drag them down out of heaven. I'm not going to affect their place in purgatory. On the other hand, we all have a care for our reputation, and we have a right to our good name. I mean, we're due that in the order of justice. Mm-hmm. And I don't know anybody that is completely indifferent to how folks will regard them after they die. In fact, for many people, the question of their legacy after they die is very important to them. And just as we have a right to our good name in this life, it seems to me we have a right to our good name even after we've passed on, because we have relatives and friends and progeny. We may have projects that we're engaged in, that we have some interest in their continuance and so forth. All of those things might be potentially damaged by calumny. And so I think it'd be wrong to speak falsehood maliciously about the dead, just as it would be wrong to speak falsehood about the living. Although, granted, if the living are going to suffer more immediate emotional blowback from it than the dead were, that doesn't justify that we should commit calumny against the dead. And so that's my kind of shooting from the hip answer, having never gotten this question before.
Great question, Elizabeth. Anytime you pop a new question at us, it's going to get our attention. We do appreciate that. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Let's go to Robin now in Needham, Massachusetts. Hey, Robin, what's on your mind today?
Hi. So I've always been interested. You talked about the historical documents that we have, the church fathers, the Apostle Paul, and even Plato, who I'd never thought about that his writings exist. But where exactly are they? Are they in the Vatican?
Thank you. There are many places, and I appreciate the question. There are many places because there are literally thousands of extant manuscripts of early copies of the New Testament, because the New Testament was widely circulated around the ancient world. I mean, over thousands of miles of territory. So they're in museums and archives all over the planet. To be sure, the Vatican has a great interest in curating these manuscripts, and they do have. There's some very, very important copies of biblical manuscripts. Codex Vaticanus is one that's actually named after the Vatican, housed in Vatican archives. But the Vatican is not the only repository of these things. Any place you have historians and archivists and archaeologists who have an interest in curating ancient texts, they're going to love to get their hands on not only biblical texts but all ancient texts that they can lay hold of. And of course, biblical texts also fall into manuscript traditions. So, for example, you'll find that, say, copies of Paul's letters circulated in North Africa will share a common body of textual variants, and those that were circulated in Byzantium will share other, mild textual variants. And so scholars of these things differentiate manuscript families, and as I said, they're going to be housed wherever these fine manuscripts can be found.
That's right. When we were in the Holy Land a couple of years ago, we were blessed to go to the Dead Sea Scrolls Museum in Jerusalem. Fascinating. Thanks so much again for your call, Robin. In a moment, we'll be talking with Kate in Wilmington, Mass., and lots more at 833-288-EWTN. It's the Monday edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. As promised, Kate is in Wilmington, Mass., listening on the Station of the Cross. Hello, Kate. What's on your mind today?
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for taking my call.
Sure.
So I've been listening to you guys for 2 years. I'm fortunate enough to be in my car for work all the time. I've learned so much. Thank you. But I was asked by a coworker over the weekend how I feel about women priests, and of course, I went, oh no, and I don't agree with it. But I didn't have a really good basis for why, so I thought, I need to call.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate the question.
Glad you called.
So, lots to say on this topic. The first reason that there are no women priests is the same reason that there are no male nuns. There are no male mothers. There are no female fathers. There are a lot of things that men and women can do that are the same. There are some things that only men can do, and some things that only women can do, precisely in virtue of being a man or a woman.
Right.
And being a priest is one of those things that only a man can do, because it's not just about fulfilling a function. All right. I mean, you could have male or female postal workers. There's nothing specific to the sex of the postal worker to deliver a letter. Priesthood's not like that. Priesthood is not something where you're just fulfilling a function, and anybody, you could train a monkey to move the elements across the altar. It doesn't work that way. You couldn't do a robot couldn't do a priest's job, and a woman can't do a man's job if the job entails the very person of the minister in their biological sex. This is one of the constituents of what it means to be a priest in their priestly activity. And that's precisely the character of a priest, because a priest does more than just move pieces around on an altar or say words and make hand gestures. The priest is actually standing in place of Christ as the husband to the bride that is the church, as the father of the family that is the church. Now, in my home, when I was growing up, my dad and mom could do a lot of things for me that was the same. They could both, cook me breakfast. They could both drive me to school. They could both smack me up something good if I got off on the wrong track. But only my dad could be a father to me. My mother, for all of her virtues, could never be a father to me.
Right.
And my father could never be a mother to me. That doesn't mean that he couldn't do some of the things that a mother often does. I mean, he could drive me, teach me, counsel me, admonish me, console me. He could do all those things. But he could never be a mother to me.
Right.
And the priest is as a husband to a bride and as a father to a family. That is a specific thing that he does that is intrinsic to his biological sex, to have those capacities, to have those, to be that person. Now, that's the kind of the deep mystery of it. It's that the priest stands in the place of Christ, and Christ's ministry is not irrespective of his sex. We know this in many ways. One of them is we know it from sacred tradition. If you look at doctrines of the Catholic Church in terms of, let's say, the degree of adherence that Catholics throughout history have held to this doctrine, some doctrines have been disputed. Now, there's a really important doctrine in the Catholic Church, namely that Jesus is God, the divinity of Christ. The divinity of Christ has been strongly disputed by lots of people, even within the Catholic Church. The 4th century of the Church was split in half because half the Church denied the divinity of Christ. That's why we had to have the Council of Nicaea. But you know what everybody in that debate agreed on? Priests were men. In the 5th century, lots of people disagreed over whether or not Mary should be called the Mother of God. It's a dogma of the Church. Mary's the Mother of God, Theotokos.
Yes.
Everybody in that debate agreed that priests were men. In the 16th century, a lot of people in the Church weren't sure whether you were justified by faith alone or by faith acting through charity. And the Church defined the dogma of justification, that we're justified by faith acting through charity. But everybody in that debate agreed that priests were men. Rome and Constantinople split over the extent of the Pope's jurisdiction. Was the Pope just the first among equals? Did he just have a primacy of honor? Or does he have universal jurisdiction over the entire Church? Catholic Church defined the doctrine of the Pope's universal jurisdiction. The Orthodox broke away from Catholic unity over that question. But everybody in those debates agreed that priests were men.
I'm seeing a trend here.
Okay. My point being that St. Vincent of Lérins wrote a long time ago in the 5th century that the Catholic faith is that which is believed everywhere, always, and by all. And by Vincent of Lérins' definition, I mean, I'm thinking the number of doctrines that's never been disputed is very small. I mean, does the book of Revelation belong in the Bible? Disputes in the early centuries about whether the book of Revelation belonged in the Bible. But every party to those disputes agreed priests were men. All right? It's one of the few doctrines that absolutely categorically meet St. Vincent's criteria. Everybody, always, everywhere understood that priests were men.
Right.
And it's also manifest in sacred scripture. All right? Because Christ was not slow to contravene the mores of his society. I mean, he would throw it in your face if he thought you were wrong, Jesus would. He was the one that was eating with prostitutes and tax collectors and sinners and offending everybody right and left. He knew all about women. He made the first witnesses that he would send out from his resurrection to be women. He was cavorting with women. He was cavorting with women that were not always well thought of in the society.
Yeah.
He didn't make any of them apostles. He only ordained men to that sacred office. And the apostles, in turn, only ordained men to those sacred offices. And when they made provision for passing on their apostolic charge to their successors, the bishops, they only ordained men and specifically stated that only men were to be ordained. So this is manifest in the tradition of the church, in the explicit teaching of sacred scripture, and the extraordinary magisterium of the church, because priests have the function of being husband to the wife, father to the family. Now, there are plenty of other things in the Catholic Church that only women can do. Men can never do them. You know, every woman who is in the domestic church as a wife has an ecclesial role in the church. No man can fill that role.
True.
Every woman who is in consecrated religious life as a consecrated virgin has a role that no man can fill. No man can have that special charism of spiritual maternity. No man can do that. Lots of things no man can do in the Catholic Church. Some things no woman can do in the Catholic Church.
Okay. There it is. Kate, if you wish, you can certainly pass on the podcast of today's program over to your friend. She can listen to it at EWTNradio.net, EWTNradio.net. It's also going to be posted on SoundCloud. We'll have both those posted in the next couple of hours. Thanks so much for your call. Call to Communion in progress here on EWTN. Looks like one line open right now, 833-288-EWTN. Let's go to Jim in Hayes, Kansas, listening on Divine Mercy Radio. Hey, Jim, what's on your mind today?
Hi. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I was just wondering, I happen to be a Catholic, but I have a lot of friends that aren't. And the thing about the Hail Mary came up.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some non-Catholics, if the word was Son of or Mother of Christ instead of Mother of God, they might decide to pray that. I mean, I understand why they say the Son of or Mother of God, but all of them don't understand that.
Sure. Thanks, Jim. I appreciate the question. So Mary has been venerated under the title Mother of God from at least the middle of the 3rd century A.D., possibly sooner. But we have textual evidence for prayers to the Blessed Virgin Mary under that title from the 250s in Alexandria. It became a title, it became an issue of contention in the 5th century, just in the way that your friends have made it a subject of contention. There were some people in the East who said, well, maybe we should call her Mother of Christ and not Mother of God. And it got to be so contentious that the church actually had to call a council about this. The Ecumenical Council, Third Ecumenical Council at Ephesus in the year 430 was about the suitability of referring to Mary as Mother of God, Theotokos in Greek. And here's what's at stake. Let's say we think that we're only going to call Mary Mother of Christ, that it's not appropriate to call her Mother of God. Well, what are we really saying? Well, what we're saying is that what it is that Mary gave birth to was just a human person, to which the divinity is added on as a kind of adjunct. Well, I understand that position, but that means that when I'm touching the flesh of Jesus, I'm not really touching divinity. I'm touching a man to whom divinity has been added as a kind of adjunct. But that's not the orthodox doctrine of who Jesus is. The orthodox doctrine of who Jesus is that he is fully God, that he is the God-man, that the divine and the human are conjoined in a single person, so that you can't have the person without having the full divinity. And there are consequences for our understanding of salvation, because The Orthodox doctrine of salvation is that it is precisely by the incarnation, it is precisely by assuming a human nature to the second person of the Trinity, that the human race is reborn in Christ and given the possibility of participating in the divine nature. That is what St. Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4, that through the promises of Christ we might become participants in the divine nature, might share in the divine nature itself in a created manner. Well, if we're not renewed in the divine person, then it's obscure how we're going to be recreated in incorporation into Christ, into the divinity. But this is part and parcel of what it means to be saved. So in order to preserve the doctrine of Christ, we must affirm that the person that the Blessed Virgin Mary gives birth to is really God. No, it also man. So we might, you could with justice say, Mary, the mother of God and man. You could say Mary, the mother of the God-man. But the title, Theotokos, Mother of God, is meant specifically to emphasize the divinity of Christ, and therefore, the preeminence, the nobility of Mary's divine maternity. Does that kick the Blessed Virgin Mary up the scale in terms of awesomeness? You better believe it does.
Oh, yes.
And if you have a problem with that, well, yeah, I can see why that would be a barrier to your accepting the Catholic faith. But the solution to the problem is not to go through the Catholic faith and remove all those things that people find offensive. If you did that all day long, you'd have no Catholic faith left at the end of the day.
Yeah. So, Jim, thank you so much for your call. We hope that's helpful for you and for friends that you're speaking with. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. I want to say a few words about a very solid thing, and that is the Catholic News Agency. It is news that you can depend on 24 hours a day. Just taking a look at the CNA website here, all kinds of wonderful stories. You may not have heard about this elsewhere. Catholic missionaries and aid workers were among the victims of that big plane crash in Ethiopia over the weekend. How horrible that was. Find out all about that at CNA's website. Also, that Utah school, you remember that there was a student last week who was forced to wipe clean his Lenten ashes. The school has now apologized. That story is on the CNA website. And what about this one? Why one Alabama man is suing on behalf of an aborted fetus. You may not find these stories elsewhere, but you will find them on CNA's website, and it is very well done and very solid. So for news you can rely on, visit CatholicNewsAgency.com, CatholicNewsAgency.com. It's an online service from EWTN News. Back to the phones now here on Call to Communion. Let's go to Patty in Tyler, Texas, listening on the EWTN app. Hey, Patty, what's on your mind today?
Hi. Thank you, gentlemen, for taking my call.
Sure.
I have somewhat of a dumb question, I think. I am reading a book that I got from EWTN. It's called 1 Minute Aquinas. And I'm in the chapter where it talks about the soul. And, you know, the plants and the animals and our soul. Well, I got to thinking, if somebody is in a vegetative state with a disease or with a respirator,
mm-hmm.
their body is not moving, and that's the soul is what gives us movement. It allows us to breathe. Is the soul already departed from that person? Because when you're disconnected, you're dead. So when exactly does our soul leave our body?
Thank you. I appreciate the question. So a person that is in a vegetative state, if that person is alive, by definition they have a soul. All right, by definition they have it, because the soul, the word soul just means that which gives animation or life to a corporeal body. So if there is life there, the soul is, you've got soul. Now, it doesn't matter, even if the life is being preserved by artificial means. I mean, you might have, it's not, so for instance, when I say that the soul gives life to my body, that doesn't mean that I don't have to eat. But there are still material elements and and conditions under which my soul is able to animate the body. One of those would be like the proper functioning of my lungs or my kidneys, my liver, or whatnot. So if I bring machinery along that helps with that, that doesn't diminish the fact that the soul is still ultimately the animating principle of the body. We're just helping the material medium to maintain enough integrity that the body-soul unity can continue. But if there is life, then by definition you have a soul. Now, when you have no life, you have no soul. Actually determining the exact moment of biological or metaphysical death is somewhat difficult. Now, from a scientific medical point of view, typically when a person has no heartbeat and no brain waves, they are regarded as biologically dead. Right? And that's a biological definition. You got no heartbeat, got no brain waves, you're dead. Here's the interesting thing. If a Catholic priest is on the way to the hospital to give last rites to a dying person, and, he steps in the elevator, but the guy on the 4th floor, heartbeat stops, brainwave stop. When the elevator arrives on the 4th floor, priest walks out, gets to the door of the hospital room, and they say, "Father, he just died." What does the priest do? Does he say, "Shucks, I missed it, turn around, get in the elevator, and go home"? Nope. It's not what he does. He marches right on in that room. He pulls out his kit. He anoints the body. He gives last rites as much as he can, does whatever he can for the body. Then he leaves. Why does he do that when we know that biologically the person just died? Because we don't know if biological death and metaphysical death exactly coincide. We don't know that. Now, we know they're temporally linked. We know that. I mean, the lag time can't be that much. But we don't know what it is. We don't know what the lag time is. And clearly, there have been people who have biologically died and then been biologically revivified and regained consciousness and memory. So whatever metaphysical death is, it didn't happen there. All right? So there's some lag time, and we don't know exactly where that falls. So the presumption is in favor of the person being alive. We're gonna presume life rather than death to be on the safe side.
Okay. Appreciate your call, Patty. Ernie is in Green Springs, Ohio, listening on Annunciation Radio. Ernie, what's on your mind today?
Yes, hi. Thanks for taking my call. This question's about the beatific vision and subsequent bodily resurrection. Now, I know that you talk a lot about how the beatific vision is experiencing the immediate intuitive presence of God at 1 Corinthians 13 face to face, and how you say that it's the most intensively experienced of all the virtues, and nothing more can be tagged. We have nothing to gain in bodily resurrection except for extensively, like you give the example of the pecan pie. You open your eyes and it's the corporeal bodily resurrection is analogous to that. So the question is would it be appropriate to say that the bodily corporeal resurrection, if it's just adding the substance back to the already to the max beatific vision, would it be appropriate to say univocally that the bodily resurrection is the incarnation of the beatific vision?
I don't know what you mean by that phrase. I don't know what you mean when you say it's the incarnation of the beatific vision.
Like just giving bodily form to the souls that are experiencing the beatific vision, giving them, putting them into a biological state again, a bodily corporeal state.
Okay, thanks. So I don't like the phraseology that suggests that the soul is a substance that can be squeezed into another substance. Putting into. I don't like that that preposition because it doesn't capture what the Catholic Church means by the soul. The soul is a form, and it informs matter. So the bodily resurrection is the informing by the soul of material, all right, but that has been glorified after the pattern of Christ. So the soul will have an immediate and intuitive knowledge of God in his essence, even without the body. But the human person is not a soul. The human person is a corporeal being whose soul has an immaterial dimension, the capacity to know and choose God. So you've got, when you have a soul but no body, you don't have a complete human person. But Christ came to save the total human person. So the resurrection of the dead is the salvation of the complete human being, body and soul, with the intuitive and immediate knowledge of the divine essence. But it's the person who knows this, and the person is a bodily unity. So, I am not my soul. All right, I am me, and the person who is David Anders is a body-soul unity. What will be saved on the last day is me, right? And I am a biological being. That's who's going to be saved. My body, soul, self that is now will be glorified. I'll have a body that doesn't sin, that doesn't decay, that doesn't age, that can walk through walls, that doesn't have to eat food, that doesn't have to drink, that won't have to sleep, that won't have to reproduce sexually, but will in an embodied state enjoy the presence of God and the physical presence of the saints and of the incarnate Lord for all eternity.
Appreciate your call, Ernie. Quick shout out here to all the people who have been texting us today. We got some terrific texts, and we're going to have to carry those over until probably tomorrow's show or even the next day. So sit tight. We'll get to your texts as soon as we can. Pat is listening right now in Ohio. Hey, Pat, what's on your mind today?
Hi, guys. I love you. I try to listen to you guys every day. I'm a building inspector, and somebody applied for a certificate of occupancy, a storefront for a witchcraft museum, and I went in there today. There's a lot of Satan stuff and a lot of... So my question, would it be a conflict to my Catholic faith if I were to approve this? I'm basically just looking at the space. I'm not looking at the content or the use. I'm just looking at, whether it's safe and whether I should sign for them to get a certificate of occupancy.
Right. Thanks. I appreciate it. So I don't know what all is entailed in certifying that a building is safe. I don't know what you're certifying, but if your only job is to verify that the building itself meets code and is safe for physical occupancy, then that is not, certainly not formally cooperating with the sale of occultic items, and it's at best remote material cooperation. So I think you're morally obligated, if your job requires you to render a verdict about whether this building is safe or not safe, and you determine that the building is safe, you're not responsible for what the tenant puts in there.
Exactly. We do appreciate your call there, Pat. Hope that helps you. A quick question here from Mike in New Orleans. Wants to know if it's true that the old Catholic Church ordains married men who only celebrate the traditional Latin Mass. Do they exercise legitimate ministry in the church as they claim?
Yeah, Old Catholic Church, not Catholic. Old Catholic Church is not Catholic, so they don't exercise a legitimate ministry.
Kind of confusing.
Because they're not Catholic.
Confusing when they have that name of Old Catholic.
It's like if EWTN started a football team and called ourselves the Crimson Tide. I mean, like, we're not the Crimson Tide.
We're just not.
I don't care what we call ourselves. We're not, we're not T-Town. We're not Tuscaloosa.
There you go.
It wouldn't be the real team.
You got that right. Dr. David Anders, thank you, my friend.
Thanks. Who are we going to get to play quarterback?
Not me, pal.
Birchfield over here?
Birchfield, I think, would do a fine job. He could throw the ball, do it just fine. Anyway, we do the show Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern, with an encore at 11 p.m. Eastern, and a best of show on Sunday at 2 p.m. Eastern. On behalf of Michael, and Ryan, I'm Tom Price. Have a great day. See you tomorrow. God bless.